The accidental Sultan Abdulhamid II was never supposed to be Sultan. Born in 1842, he was the nephew of the reigning Sultan and far down the line of succession. His youth was quiet and solitary. While other Ottoman princes were known for their extravagance, Abdulhamid was a reserved, skillful carpenter and a shrewd investor who built a considerable personal fortune. He watched with quiet anxiety as his uncles, the Sultans Abdulhamid I and Abdulaziz, pushed the empire down a path of Western-style reforms known as the Tanzimat, reforms that were financed by massive, crippling loans from European banks. 1870s were a period of profound crisis for the Ottoman Empire, the sick man of Europe. The state was bankrupt, nationalist revolts were erupting across its Balkan provinces, and a new generation of Western-educated intellectuals and bureaucrats, known as the Young Ottomans, were demanding a constitution and a parliamentary government. To curb the Sultan's absolute power. In a dizzying series of events in 1876, Sultan Abdulaziz was deposed and died under mysterious circumstances. His successor, Abdulhamid's older brother Murad V, suffered a complete mental breakdown after only 3 months on the throne. Suddenly, in this moment of extreme national peril, the quiet, unassuming Abdulhamid was thrust onto the ancient throne of Osman. The great powers of Europe and the reformers at home saw him as weak and pliable, a man they could easily control. It was a profound miscalculation, the promise and the purge to secure the throne. Abdulhamid made a historic promise to the reformers. In December 1876, he promulgated the first ever Ottoman constitution, a document that created an elected parliament and enshrined, on paper, the principles of a limited constitutional monarchy. It was a moment of great hope for the liberal young Ottomans, but Abdulhamid was playing a long game. The constitution was a tool, not a conviction. His immediate crisis was a disastrous war with Russia, which ended in a humiliating Ottoman defeat. In 1878, citing the national emergency of the war and the need for decisive leadership, Abdulhamid did what he had likely intended to do all along. He used an emergency clause in the very constitution he had just approved to suspend the parliament and the constitution indefinitely. The parliament was dissolved, and the leading reformers and intellectuals who had championed it were arrested, exiled, or silenced. The brief 2-year experiment with constitutional monarchy was over. The era of Abdulhamid's absolute rule had begun. The Caliph and the gilded Cag Abdulhamid was driven by a deep-seated and, given his family's history, not entirely unfounded paranoia. He retreated from the grand accessible Topkapi Palace and sequestered himself in the heavily guarded labyrinthine Yildiz Palace, overlooking the Bosphorus. This palace became his fortress, his government center, and his gilded cage. He rarely ventured out, and he trusted almost no one. From this isolated nerve center, he ruled his vast empire through a system of absolute personal control, aided by 2 modern technologies, the telegraph and the spy network. He had telegraph lines laid to every corner of his empire, demanding instant, direct reports from his provincial governors. He bypassed his own ministers, creating a shadow government of palace functionaries, loyal only to him. His most formidable instrument of control was his infamous secret police and his vast network of spies and informants. Thousands of agents, known as the Hafis, were deployed throughout the empire, from the coffee houses of Istanbul to the distant villages of Arabia. They listened for any hint of dissent, any whisper of conspiracy. Fear of the Sultan's spies became a pervasive feature of daily life. This system of surveillance, combined with a strict censorship of the press, allowed Abdulhamid to maintain an iron grip on his empire for 3 decades. The Pan-Islamic project, facing the constant threat of European imperialist encroachment and the rise of ethnic nationalism among his Christian subjects in the Balkans, Abdulhamid sought a new, powerful ideology to unify his diverse and crumbling empire. he founded in Pan-Islamism. While previous sultans had held the title of Caliph, the successor to the Prophet Muhammad, Abdulhamid was the first to actively and systematically use it as a powerful tool of foreign policy and internal cohesion. He sent envoys and missionaries to Muslim communities around the world, from Africa to India and China, promoting himself as the spiritual leader and protector of all Muslims. This was a direct challenge to the European colonial powers, particularly Britain and France, who ruled over millions of Muslim subjects. The message was clear: an attack on the Ottoman Empire was an attack on the Caliph, and by extension, an attack on Islam itself, internally. He emphasized his role as the pious Caliph to rally the loyalty of his Arab, Kurdish, and Albanian subjects, hoping to create a bond of religious solidarity that would be stronger than the pull of ethnic nationalism. He sponsored the construction of the Hejaz Railway, a monumental project designed to connect Damascus to the holy cities of Medina and Mecca. While promoted as a way to ease the Hajj pilgrimage, its primary purpose was strategic: to allow the Sultan to rapidly move troops and extend his authority into the Arabian Peninsula. Modernization by decree. While a deeply conservative autocrat in his political methods, Abdulhamid was also a determined modernizer. He was not against Western technology or administrative techniques. He was against the Western liberal ideas that often came with them. He oversaw a period of significant state-directed modernization aimed at strengthening the empire so it could resist foreign domination. He continued the legal, bureaucratic, and military reforms of the Tanzimat era, but under his own strict control. He expanded the railway network, not just in the Hejaz, but across Anatolia and the Balkans. He developed a modern telegraph system that became the nervous system of his centralized state. Most importantly, he poured resources into education. He opened a vast number of modern, Western-style professional schools for law, medicine, engineering, and civil service. His goal was not to create liberal intellectuals, but to train a new generation of loyal, skilled, and secularly minded Ottoman officials and officers who could run his modern state and army. In a great historical irony, it would be the graduates of these very schools who would ultimately become his downfall. The Red Sultan and the Armenian massacres, the darkest stain on Abdulhamid's reign, and the origin of his bloody nickname, was his response to the rising tide of Armenian nationalism. The Armenians, a Christian minority concentrated in the eastern provinces of the empire, began to demand greater rights and autonomy in the late 19th century. Inspired by the successful revolts in the Balkans, Abdulhamid, paranoid about any movement that could lead to the further dismemberment of his empire, and egged on by the European powers' professed concern for the Armenians, responded with brutal force. Between 1894 and 1896, a series of widespread massacres were carried out against the Armenian population. While the Sultan may not have directly ordered every killing, the state's complicity was undeniable. The army stood by while Kurdish irregulars and local mobs slaughtered tens, perhaps hundreds of thousands of Armenian men, women, and children. These events, known as the Hamidian Massacres, horrified the Western world and earned Abdulhamid the lasting moniker, the Red Sultan or Bloody Sultan. The Young Turk Revolution by the early 20th century. Discontent with Abdulhamid's autocratic rule was growing, especially among the very people his modern schools had produced. A new, secret revolutionary movement emerged, known as the Committee of Union and Progress, CUP, or more popularly, the Young Turks. They were a coalition of exiled intellectuals, disaffected civil servants, and most importantly, army officers, stationed in the empire's troubled Balkan provinces. These young, patriotic officers saw the Sultan's spies and his isolationist policies as a source of national weakness and humiliation. In 1908, a faction of the army in Macedonia, led by young Turk officers, launched a revolt and threatened to march on Constantinople. Abdulhamid, realizing that the army he had spent 3 decades modernizing would no longer obey him, was faced with a choice: civil war or capitulation. In a stunning reversal, the old Sultan gave in. On July 24, 1908, he announced that the 1876 Constitution, which he had suspended for 30 years, was restored. The announcement was met with scenes of incredible public jubilation, as Christians, Jews, and Muslims celebrated together in the streets, hailing the end of the era of spies and the dawn of a new age of liberty. The fall of the last autocrat Abdulhamid II remained on the throne as a constitutional monarch, but his power was gone. The Young Turks now controlled the government. The old Sultan, however, was a master of intrigue. In 1909, he appeared to support a counter-revolutionary uprising of conservative religious students and soldiers in Constantinople, who called for a return to Islamic law and the Sultan's absolute rule. The Young Turks, who had moved their base of power to Salonika, responded decisively. They sent an action army to the capital, which swiftly crushed the counter-revolt. Convinced that the Sultan had orchestrated the entire affair, they made their final move. The newly restored parliament voted to depose Abdulhamid II. He was sent into exile in Salonika, a prisoner in the very city where the revolution against him had been born. He spent his final years under house arrest, watching from a distance as the ambitious but reckless Young Turk government led the Ottoman Empire into a series of disastrous Balkan wars and ultimately into its final, fatal alliance with Germany in World War I. He died in 1918, just months before the empire he had struggled for so long to hold together would finally collapse. In total defeat, a contradictory legacy. Abdulhamid II remains one of the most controversial figures in modern Middle Eastern history. To his detractors, he was the Red Sultan, a paranoid tyrant whose bloody massacres and oppressive spy network stifled all progress. To his admirers, he was a shrewd and pious leader, the last great sultan who skillfully used diplomacy and modernization to postpone the collapse of a decaying empire for another 30 years against overwhelming odds. He was, in reality, a tragic figure of immense contradiction, a modernizer who feared modern ideas, a caliph who used Western technology to enforce his will, and an autocrat whose own educational reforms created the very revolutionaries who would overthrow him. His long, lonely reign from the gilded cage of Yildiz Palace was the final, desperate act of Ottoman absolutism, a complex and often brutal struggle against the inevitable tide of history.